Hello, this is Chapter 14, Part 2. Chapter 14 is Psychological Disorders. We're going to pick up with obsessive compulsive and related disorders. And this is another category, separate category from anxiety disorders in the DSM-5. I'm making a point of that because it used to be considered an anxiety disorder. One of the changes to DSM-5 is thinning out of the anxiety disorder categories, and obsessive compulsive and related disorders were pulled out. Even though anxiety is a part of these disorders, there are some fundamental differences in how that anxiety is expressed and experienced. Obsessive compulsive disorder is one that is common in the sense that everyone knows about it. It's often you hear people say something like, I'm so OCD, I have to whatever. Usually that's an understatement. Those people are really not OCD. They just are kind of stating a preference for things. Everybody has preferences for how they like the world to be. But obsessive compulsive disorder is when those preferences take complete control of someone's life. In obsessive compulsive disorder, these preferences or obsessions, these persistent, uncontrollable thoughts, take over someone's life, and they're the only things they can think about. And then there's also the compelling need to perform repetitive acts, and these are the compulsions. Now, the compulsion is a psychological experience. It is a sense of the need to do something, but it is different from the uncontrollable thoughts, the obsessions. The compulsions usually result in repetitive acts, ritualistic behaviors that can be observed. It's a little bit more difficult to observe thoughts directly, but obsessive compulsive disorder is made up of both these uncontrollable thoughts and the compulsions. The obsessions and the compulsions go together. An obsession, for example, might be concern about germs. Well, this concern about germs, this uncontrollable thought, is anxiety producing. So here's where it used to be seen as an anxiety disorder. The obsessions create anxiety for the individual, worry. But what happens is that the compulsion reduces the anxiety. Individuals come up with a ritualistic behavior which serves to reduce their anxiety, gives them a sense they're doing something about it. And then it becomes this cycle, an uncontrollable cycle. The compulsion doesn't make the anxiety go away, it just reduces it. So ritualistic cleaning reduces someone's anxiety about germs, but doesn't make it go away. It is kind of reinforcing, right? It makes the anxiety go away, reduces it. That's negative reinforcement. So the compulsions, these ritualistic behaviors, are fed because they do reduce the anxiety. This is a clip from YouTube of a spokeswoman for the obsessive compulsive, I forget the name of it exactly, but a national organization that was created to raise awareness for OCD. And this was on television several years ago, but I think it's a pretty compelling example of the disorder.
Elizabeth McInvale has lost control of her life. The 20-year-old University of Houston student scrubs her hands sometimes up to 100 times a day.
Clean underneath all my fingernails every time.
You can see how raw and discolored her hands are. Her fear of contamination results in many other exhausting daily rituals that she just can't help. Elizabeth suffers from obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD.
Ritual after ritual, day after day, and OCD becomes a living nightmare.
Elizabeth can't even make it through part of her day without these neurotic, obsessive actions to avoid germs.
So I have to open the door with my foot.
See how she won't even touch the light switch with her hands? And when she tries to get dressed, many of her clothes are off limits.
All the stuff that's contaminated in here, Like these pants are contaminated from vacation.
Her life, like millions of others with OCD, is so tough that she sometimes takes out her aggressions on her walls.
I get so frustrated that I kick and punch holes.
No one knows Elizabeth's frustration more than her sister, who also lives with her.
It's so sad to see my sister tell me multiple times a month that she wishes she was dead. And I mean, you can't do anything about it.
And Elizabeth isn't alone in this nightmare.
There are probably between 4 and 8 million people in the United States alone that have obsessive-compulsive disorder.
Among them, actor Leonardo DiCaprio says he was sometimes obsessive-compulsive as a child. Fittingly, DiCaprio played another high-profile OCD sufferer, Howard Hughes, in the film The Aviator. And notice on Deal or No Deal, Howie Mandel won't shake hands with contestants because of his reported OCD.
I don't shake hands. What I do is I do this because I'm a little bit of a germaphobe.
And recently, international soccer star David Beckham revealed he has some form of the disorder. While there is no cure for Elizabeth and others suffering from OCD, behavior modification treatment has proven a step in the right direction. And that's why Elizabeth is now the national spokesperson for OCD awareness.
My name's Elizabeth, and I have obsessive-compulsive disorder. There are 500,000 teenagers in America just like me.
But for Elizabeth McInvale, getting help for those in her shoes is the best therapy of all.
There's people out there that struggle more than I do, and my heart goes out to them.
You can see with Elizabeth there, OCD is not just a matter of being particular or wanting things a certain way. Her concern about germs has overtaken her life. It is maladaptive. It is preventing her from living to her fullest. And there's also this irrational nature to it. A concern about germs is a good thing. It's sensible to wash one's hands. It's sensible to prepare food in a way to minimize contamination. But with Elizabeth, that thought has become something that has completely overtaken her life. And the irrationality to it is she knows that it is maladaptive. She knows that it is her obsession and thoughts are out of what is regular and demanded by the situation. And it just doesn't kind of make sense to anybody but her. I've had students look at that clip and they say, well, she's worried about contamination, but only on her hands. She doesn't worry about walking, where her feet might go and her feet touching everything, and doesn't worry about germs there. And that's exactly it. That it is not a rational and controllable thought. It's something that has taken over her life. The compulsions with Elizabeth, you see the compulsions, the ritualistic hand washing, how she takes care of herself is having physical implications for her hands. Clearly, she's under a lot of stress and frustration. She takes that other ways. That has negative health impacts. But she's also got some rituals and thinking about her clothes. And she's very methodical in talking about her clothes, and they're decontaminated and they're organized. And I'm sure she has a ritual for how they get decontaminated. The next disorder is post-traumatic stress disorder, which is in another category of disorders, in its own category, and again used to be considered an anxiety disorder, but there's much more to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, than just anxiety. Back in the 80s, PTSD was not a disorder, was not in the DSM at all, and it was first described as a syndrome. And I remember being in class and hearing professors lecture about this emerging disorder that seemed to be prevalent in Vietnam War veterans. This is the 80s. This is 15, 20 years after their service in the war. But all of a sudden they were experiencing flashbacks. They were experiencing anxiety. They had a variety of symptoms related to their service in the war that they had not previously exhibited. And it went by several kinds of names till they settled on post-traumatic stress disorder. Since then, it has been defined as a disorder and has been recognized not just to the experience of combat, but any major traumatic event can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. In 20 some odd years, it's gone from this new emerging disorder to something everybody knows about. The experience of a major traumatic event could include war. It could be sexual assault, witnessing death, experiencing some natural disaster, anything that is traumatic, deeply traumatic. It says post-traumatic. It originally was seen as surfacing years after, but it need not. Some people can experience symptoms immediately after the traumatic event. As part of the difficulty of the disorder is sometimes it lies dormant, sometimes it does not. The symptoms of the disorder are that the individual often experiences flashbacks. Flashbacks are not just remembering the event. It's not, like sitting in class and me asking about your first day of kindergarten and you might remember it. A flashback is a reliving of the event, a sensory experience of reliving the event in the individual's mind. They are transported to another place, another time, and effectively relive it. People report sounds and smells associated with the original event that are not present at the time. It is a kind of much more than memory experience, but a perceptual experience as well. There's emotional impacts of the disorder. There's emotional numbness. They react kind of. Individuals with PTSD report not feeling joy, really not also kind of feeling sadness. They're just kind of numb to the things around them, but at the same time can have bouts of very heightened anger and guilt. There's survivor guilt. They will think why did they survive when perhaps others didn't. They think maybe they could have done more when they could not have. And often the flashbacks aren't necessarily accurate in terms of what happens, but kind of reflect perhaps the person's guilt and anger. The heightened arousal, these people or individuals with PTSD are sometimes on edge. They're waiting for something to happen. It's been described to me as like kind of going to a haunted house. You know something is going to happen, you just don't know when. And so they're kind of on edge always and can be triggered by things that are not related to the trauma, but just trigger them simply because they're on edge and experiencing this heightened emotional arousal. We talked earlier about the diathesis stress model, and it seems that one of why is this not going to advance on me? There we go. One of the predispositions for the disorder has to do with brain structure. This chart's from your textbook, and I've doctored it a little bit to help understand this. It is an important finding, and it is an example of the diathesis stress model. Now, diathesis is a biological predisposition, and the stress is some environmental event that occurs. Now, in this study, they looked at using MRIs, looked at the size of individuals' hippocampi. The hippocampus is a brain structure involved in memory. And it was noticed that veterans who had been exposed to combat and had PTSD, that is, let's see if I can get my pen going here. There it is, right over here. The veterans had PTSD, had smaller sized hippocampi than veterans who did not have PTSD. There was a difference in brain structure between individuals with PTSD and those without PTSD. Now, both of these individuals in both of these groups had been exposed to combat. So the question then becomes, right? They also, the group with the smaller hippocampus also had PTSD. So the question is, was the smaller brain structure, did that happen before the disorder or as a result of the disorder? It's been demonstrated in other disorders that the disorder can cause physical changes in a brain. So it's possible that it is the incidence of PTSD that reduced the volume of these individuals' hippocampuses. So the question was, is it a cause or an effect? Now this study is very neat because this is a twin study. These individuals in this study had identical twins, monozygotic twins, and they're represented with the pink bars. They also measured the size of the hippocampuses. Anyway, the size of the hippocampuses for those individuals. And what you see is the twins who were unexposed to combat, bar there number 2, this one here, had smaller hippocampal volumes, just like their brothers, twins, who did experience combat and had PTSD. Now, the twins here, number 2, the unexposed to combat twins, did not have post-traumatic stress disorder. So this strongly suggests that the smaller hippocampus volume is something that existed before the individuals experienced combat and developed the disorder. It seems having, and when I look at it, right, having a large hippocampal volume seems to inoculate the individual from the disorder to some extent. This is actually kind of a remarkable study that they found these individuals and were able to zero in on this particular brain structure. Depressive disorders, again, is another category. It used to be in prior DSMs was a much larger category, but it's been altered somewhat. Some disorders actually pulled out and other ones actually moved in. It includes all kinds of disorders associated with depression. We're going to talk about major depressive disorder, but this category also includes things such as seasonal affective disorder, SAD, seasonal affective disorder, which is a cyclical depression in which individuals exhibit signs of depression during the winter months rather than summer months. Some individuals will show the reverse pattern, but most display these emotional patterns with the seasons. Also included in here is postpartum depression, which is a depressive episode experienced by women who have recently given birth. Major depressive disorder is what people think of usually when they say depression. It is the particular experience that is more common and what people mean when they say depression. It once was known as unipolar depression, but now known as major depressive disorder. The category used to be called mood disorders, and unipolar means that the mood only moved in one direction, and individuals with the disorder experienced moods that were on one end of a scale. This clip shows is a documentary that shows the experience of an individual with depression. And you can see it's 8.5 minutes long there. This is posted on Blackboard, and it is worth watching the entire thing. But in the interest of class time, we're not going to watch the entire thing here. Pointer is being... There we go.
This little bag of delights is my medication bag. That's the Vepramine, which antidepressants, which I take at night. That's Temazepam, which is pretty heavy sleeping tablets. Knock out elephant nervous. And that's fluoxetine, Prozac, which I'm going to take now. Even though I'm not ashamed of my illness, I don't tell a lot of people. It's a bit of a private thing. Depression is actually viewed in two ways. Firstly, it's viewed as just, oh, it's not a real illness, you're just a bit sad, you're just not very happy, you've had a bad day. Or secondly, people think it's a mental illness, and that's it. They just think of nutters and tabloid headlines and maniacs and things like that. People just react with disbelief, mostly. Shake yourself up. All you need is a kick up the arse, that's what you get. You know, it's not a real illness. You don't really need tablets for that. I'll bet I'm not mad anymore. Well, it's Wednesday night. I just got in from work not long ago. I actually had a very good day today. And I'm certainly, at the moment, out of the deep depression that I seem to have been in for a while. And I find it hard, really, to see any future.
So things seem pretty black, huh?
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of, what's the point? What's the point of doing anything? I think I feel constantly exhausted. Everything I do always exhausts me, and I feel just exhausted mentally rather than physically. Oh, I've got a badge. Downhill from here, it says. It's all downhill from here. It's all downhill from here. Probably right. 3 decades. It's not a bad cricket score. There's only been times when I never thought I'd get this far, so in some ways I'm quite pleased.
Why's that, Steve?
Well, I believe it's down in most parts of my illness to depression. It's a very debilitating illness. It's not just about being a bit sad every now and again. It actually takes over your life, and you can't. It sounds strange, but it's just impossible to do things. It just is not possible. You don't have the willpower. You don't have the motivation. When I was 10 years old, my mother, she committed suicide whilst on a family shopping trip. It's probably very difficult to trust anybody ever in that life ever again. I tend to have gone through life either trying to build myself up into this thing that I'm not. In order to get people to like me and need me and want me. Got to sort out, Vic. You know that anyway. Happiness just isn't a part of my life that I can keep going for very long. I know that sounds stupid, and I know that sounds completely crazy. But it's not.
It didn't just affect our marriage, it was always a part of our marriage, really. It was always there in the background. Steve quite often said that I was his miracle cure.
Tell you what else about I was inside.
The back of your mind, you know that it's not true really, and he was by no means better. One day he'd be fine, and the next day he would be quite depressed. Sometimes when you walked through the door you didn't know what you were going to find. I'm just grateful for the time we did have together, and certainly if he asked me again, I'd get married again tomorrow. I wouldn't do anything any different, and I don't think he would either.
I've been a loser all my life.
Steve clearly suffering from depression. And again, people use that word, they throw it around very easily. Oh, I'm so depressed, there is no ice cream in the refrigerator, in the freezer. The disorder depression is much, much more than feeling sadness. Sadness is normal, sadness is common. Depression, like we've seen with anxiety, is when that sadness takes over someone's life. And Steve is experiencing that. You can see the pain. Often people with depression describe it as a physical pain, and you can see that in his video diary at times. I think the video of Steve is enlightening because it displays depression as it's really experienced, not as people think it is. People often think an individual with depression will just sit in a dark room all day and not have contact with anyone, and that can happen, but it is not that person's entire life. In the DSM, the major depressive episode is marked by 5 or more of the following symptoms, and they have to last for at least 2 weeks. So think about what that says about normal behavior. To experience these symptoms for a day or two is entirely normal, average. It's when they persist and when they take over someone's life that it moves into a disorder, and probably should be met with some variety of care. Now, the symptoms must include either 1 or 2 on this list. Now, 1 or 2 is depressed mood for most of the day, which I think is kind of maybe dispelling some myths. People with depression are not depressed 24/7. They don't display this unipolar depressed mood all the time. In fact, in the video with Steve, he smiled and cracked some jokes at several times, but for most of the day experienced a dark, depressed mood. The second thing is a loss of interest in normal daily activities. And you can kind of hear that sometimes in Steve's description. He's like, what's the point? What's the point of going on? And he gets the birthday card that says, it's all downhill from here. And he thinks, well, yeah, that's probably right. He's probably experiencing both of these particular symptoms. The other symptoms include a weight change, change in activity level. Now, the change in activity level is usually towards less activity. Daily fatigue or loss of energy. People with depression describe it as exhaustion, not just being emotionally tired, but physically tired as well, and find it hard to do the variety of things they need to do every day. Individuals often have a negative self-concept. Steve talked about how he felt unworthy and a loser. This negative self-concept tends to influence how people interpret the world. They have experiences and interpret them negatively, where other people probably would not see the negative aspect. There's cognitive thoughts in that individuals often have trouble concentrating and making decisions, and just can't think. And for students, this often leads to poor course behavior, if not just complete withdrawal from the university, because they experience difficulty doing their normal daily activities. Suicidal thoughts are also a symptom of major depressive disorder, and I think here is another kind of misconception. People think everyone with depression has suicidal thoughts. But notice it's not 1 or 2, right? Depression must include a depressed mood for most of the day or loss of interest in daily activities. It does not have to include suicidal thoughts. Individuals with depression are at a heightened risk for suicide, but the symptom is suicidal thoughts, and that ties in with the negative self-concept. Far fewer people carry out the negative thoughts than have them. The thoughts are more common than the act. This will be the end of part 2.